Hello. Today in the storytelling playlist, I'm going to discuss um, my hometown. The last video, I talked about drive-in theaters, but this one, I'm going to go with the more of the darker side of Detroit. Um, and I'm going to tell you a few anecdotes about my time there as far as not how rough it is, but how desperate things can be there. Um, so there'll be a few anecdotes and just some random thoughts, but I'm going to start with I lived in the Cass Corridor. Uh, I guess it was around 2001 or two, right around the turn of the millennia, and um, at that time, it was just starting to come out of its darkest days, really. In the 90s, it was quite bad. 80s and 90s were pretty terrible. And it was still bad, but maybe things were starting to turn a little bit. But I lived on the Cass Corridor, and, you know, back at that time, the northern part of the Cass Corridor was where Wayne State University is located, which is still the case. But the southern part of the corridor had a lot of bars and prostitutes. So it was pretty shady depending on where you were on the actual street. And my apartment was kind of on the edge of those two worlds, I guess. So I lived in a really dilapidated building because at the time I didn't have much money, and I was going through this sort of reappraisal of my life. Um, but because I lived downtown, there weren't really a lot of jobs down there. So uh, I had to commute to the suburbs. And I was working at a restaurant at that time, a restaurant with a bar, so to try to get a lot of tips, right? And I didn't have a car. Uh, Earlier that year, the axle of my truck broke, and I didn't have that much money, so I decided just to total the car. Plus, I felt like spiritually, I was kind of done with it. So I was taking the city bus out into the suburbs, which was an experience in itself. Um, I would say about 99% of the time I was the only white person on the bus. And I was going through some not super rough neighborhoods, but pretty rough. And I had my share of racist comments and people messing with me. It didn't happen every day, and sometimes people would defend me. Um, but it did happen with frequency to the point where riding the bus was a daily ordeal, I guess. Not just because of what was happening on the bus, but also um, just the frequency of the buses, and they were often late, or the connections weren't that easy to get, or things like that. So Detroit is just not set up for that kind of thing. I mean, because of the car industry, it's been set up for automobile navigation, not buses and um, bicycles and stuff. So eventually, one night, I was coming home from work, and I would come home quite late. So I would take one bus. It was the last bus that would go down, but there was a connection all the way downtown, which was still quite far away from my house. So I'd have to take another bus from there. And because the restaurant would end so late, I could take the last one, and then I'd only have to wait a little while to take the first city bus to my house. And there was usually, I think, about half hour, 45-minute of downtime where I'd have to sort of wait in this. I wouldn't call it a shady part of town, but at that time of night, it was quite empty. So, it wasn't always the safest place to be getting a bus. So one night I'm coming home and I have my money, which is mostly dollar bills because it was tips. And so that's in my pocket, and I'm thinking, wow, it was a pretty good night. I think I had maybe over $200 in my pocket, so I had quite a lot of money. And I'm waiting there, and every time I would wait there, I'd constantly be like snapping my head around at any noise or looking, because I was often the only one at the bus stop. And so this guy, I see this like shadow coming towards me, it's sort of backlit by some of the lights. And I'm like thinking, oh, okay, here we go, because who knows who this is going to be, and hopefully they're just a person waiting for the bus, but in Detroit you never know. So I'm looking, and they're kind of shuffling toward me, and then they kind of come into the light that I can see their face finally, and it's a homeless guy, and he's got like pus coming out of his eyes, right? And he just looks pretty hit up. His lips are all, it was in the winter time, so his lips are all chapped, and he had like kind of food in his beard and stuff, and he just didn't look good. In fact, he almost looked like he might have been sick. So I was like, oh, okay, here we go. Because I knew he was going to ask me for money, because when you live there, at least at this time, that was a constant occurrence. So I braced for that. But what I didn't expect is that he didn't ask me for money. He just grabbed my scarf, because I had a scarf on because it was cold, and we both kind of tensed for a second. I was like thinking, is he going to try to rob me? And, I clenched my fist. I was about to punch him, and he started doing this with my scarf, right? And he kind of laughed. And so I thought it was kind of not a joke, but like passive aggressive kind of joke, right? And I would get those often a lot because I was white in a predominantly black city. I'm not saying every black person in town would do this to me. In fact, it was a minority of people that did this to me, but there were definitely people that did it to me. And, there would be a lot of passive aggressive comments or things like that. And so I just thought it was another one of these kind of things. So I kind of smiled to diffuse it a little bit, but then he started yanking on my scarf really tightly, and he started to try to choke me with the scarf. And so I had to push him away. I didn't assault him, but I pushed him really hard, and he kind of slipped a bit. I can't recall if he actually fell, but I turned and I just started running. Because one thing you have to keep in mind is, in this kind of situation, you don't know if he's the only person. There could be other people there, and who knows, So I just decided, split-second decision, to just run home. So I ran really fast, and it was icy and, kind of snowy, and it was hard to run. And I constantly was looking over my shoulder, but, it was like 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning. So like, there wasn't a lot of people around, which made it actually scarier, because if there were people around, I could have been like, hey, this guy attacked me or whatever. But eventually I got home. And so after that time, it was quite hard to do that ride, because I always sort of wondered if I'd see this guy again, or if someone else would do the same thing. And fortunately, I only stayed in that apartment for another month or so, I think, a few months, until the early spring, until it started thawing, and then I moved into Hamtramck with a friend, and that improved the situation immensely. But that's sort of one instance where, Detroit almost got me, I guess. Another story, this one's a little bit more comical, I guess. In Detroit, people often reclaim buildings and make them into something different. So a friend of mine, he rented this funeral home from the owner of a restaurant that we worked at, right? And the funeral home was sort of turned into a house, and he would have parties there. I actually think I mentioned it in one of my other videos about a Ouija board experience that we had there. But anyway, this was a different night, and we were there. And I think we were just hanging out and like chatting, and there was 5 or 6 of us there. Maybe it might have been after we got off work, so we went back to his house. And the funeral home was in a pretty bad part of town, a pretty burnt out part of town where there wasn't a lot around it. So the owner of the building had put a gate around the funeral home, and it was sturdy, but if someone really wanted to get in, they can get in. They just kind of have to break the lock or whatever. So we're there, and we hear this sort of bang, right? And we're like, what was that? And in Detroit, you kind of hear that stuff often. You hear sirens a lot, you hear banging, sometimes you hear a gunshot, you hear a lot of things like that. So at first, we were just like, oh, whatever. But then we kind of heard like the gate sort of slide, and that was like, what the fuck? Oh, excuse my language. So my friend, the one that was living in the building, he sort of ran over to the window to look because his car was in there, right? And the gate was wide open, and he's like, what's going on? So he looks around, and he sort of calls us over to the window, and we all kind of go to the window, and we're looking, and we see that his car hood is up, right? And you can kind of see the legs of someone, but you can't see anything else. And we're like, what's going on? So he yells down, I'm calling the police, get the out of my house, out of my yard, blah, blah, blah. And the guy doesn't respond. He's still doing something. So my friend calls the police, and we are watching intently to see what if he's trying to steal the car or what he's doing. Because we were going to go down there. If he's going to try to steal the car, we're going to confront him, but we also didn't know how dangerous he was, or if he had a gun, or you never know in Detroit. So we were kind of perplexed at what to do. So we are watching, and then suddenly he stands up, and the guy is enormous. He's gigantic, and we're like, whoa. And he has the car battery, and he just puts it on his shoulder, and we can see the police car coming down the street, and he sees the police car, and he just starts running. And so we run to the opposite window to see the street, and we're all running and looking at what's going to happen, because we don't know if the police are going to like shoot him or like, but in those situations you have really no idea, and we don't know if there's another police car coming from the other way or what's going to happen. So we're like watching, and the guy is literally running down the street with this car battery on his shoulder. And I don't know if you've ever lifted up a car battery, but they're actually quite heavy. And it was just a shock to see him doing that. And he just sort of ran off, and the police didn't catch him. Obviously, they asked us a bunch of questions. They came to the door, and, I don't think my friend had insurance, so he had to buy a new car battery. And, at that time in Detroit, a lot of people didn't have insurance because it was too expensive, and the job didn't offer it, and all these things. So he got kind of screwed in that situation. So yeah, I mean, it was comical in a way seeing this guy running with this battery, but it was very Detroit. Tangentially, there was another thing that often would happen, and I've mentioned it to people in Korea, and they just laugh. And the fact that in Detroit, people will have their screen doors stolen off their houses, you know. And my friends here were always like, why would someone do that? It's just a screen door. But they don't realize that they sell it to scrap yards for like aluminum and stuff, for metals. So, you know, hubcaps, things like that, people just steal. And I mean, one time I had a truck before I totaled it, with the axle broken. And I came out to it, and there was glass all over the ground, and my driver's side window was broken. And I was like, great. And I looked in, and all my change was gone, and I had maybe 20 CDs in there or something. Those were all gone. And it's a weird feeling because, you know, you think, you know, someone just broke in, you know, and now they could break in at any time, or my house, or it gives you a very unsettled feeling. The last anecdote, I don't know if I've mentioned this in a previous video, but I did do one about one of my novels that is set in Detroit. I think I might have touched on this, but I'm going to tell the whole story, and this will be the last anecdote here, about the craziness of Detroit, of living in Detroit. So I was at a cafe with my friend that I used to work at, and we were just chatting, catching up. And we came back to my house, which was about a block away from the cafe. And as we're coming around the block, I see that my building is on fire. So I'm like, oh, great. You know, like, oh, no. You know, I can't even really explain, like, the thoughts that go through your head when you see the place that you live, like, on fire. So I'm thinking, oh my God, all my art, all my CDs, all the things I own, my books, everything is probably gone, right? So we get there, and they obviously won't let us go in the building. There's a fire department there and stuff. And, you know, the third floor is on fire, and they're putting it out. And I'm just like, oh God. So my friend tells me I can stay with him that night. And eventually I find out that because I wasn't there, the fire department put an axe through my door, right? Luckily, all my stuff was not destroyed. And even because it was on the third floor and I lived on the first floor, there wasn't even smoke damage. But the door was an issue because they demolished this door. There's literally, it was like a cartoon almost. There was like a person-shaped hole through the door where they chopped it down and like came in through the door to see if someone was in here sleeping or something. And, you know, I was like, okay. And I knew that it was going to be hard to get this fixed because the building I lived in was kind of a shady building, and the manager, he wasn't lazy, but he was constantly having to fix all kinds of crap because the people that lived there, a lot of them were junkies or crackheads, or just some of them were like insane. I think I was the only person, there might have been one or two more that lived in there that were like semi-normal, that even had jobs maybe. But, you know, I knew it was going to take a long time for him to fix it. So I did the only thing I could think of. And I had a big piece of plywood that I was doing an art project on. And so I just screwed that in, right, to the door to kind of create some barrier, because I was lucky, first of all, that all my stuff wasn't stolen, because when I got back there the next morning, it was sort of already dealt with. And, you know, a lot of the people I lived with, like I said, were on drugs, so they easily could have just walked into my place and took all my stuff. Miraculously, they did not. But, you know, it was a challenge because he didn't fix it for a long time. Like, maybe a month, I don't really remember, but it was a long time. And so, I'd have to go to sleep knowing that just this piece of plywood was sort of stopping me from the rest of Detroit. And eventually I got a new door and I moved out shortly after that. But what I found out after the fact is the fire was started because there was a junkie on the third floor and the manager was trying to evict him. I think it was two. I think it was a him and a her, trying to convict them. And in retaliation, they lit their mattress on fire and threw it down the stairwell. So obviously, it caught the back stairwell on fire, and then it went up to the third floor. Somehow, it did not catch the rest of the building on fire. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff that happens in Detroit when you live there. And there are, I have many, many, many more stories about that, but those are sort of the few that come into my head off the top of my head. So maybe I'll do a second episode of this one with some more stories at a later date. Anyway, if you want to like and subscribe, that would be great. Hit the bell icon if you like my stories, or I have a lot of other videos that deal with like spiritual topics and the occult and some things about Korea as well, if you want to check some of those out. Anyway, take care. Have a good day. Bye.